The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
A beleaguered Congressman George Hansen goes before the Republican Party faithful last night in Pocatello, sounding like a candidate who's ready to run for re-election.
Now, I'm not prepared to quit. I'm prepared to go on just as long as you'll support me.
Tonight, we'll talk with Congressman Hansen, among others, about his political future. Good evening. Citing overwhelming support from the Republican rank and file, Idaho Congressman George Hansen, convicted earlier this week of 4 felony counts, says he will run for re-election. Hansen, convicted on Monday of filing false financial disclosure reports, has kept fellow Republicans guessing all week as to his future political plans. But Hansen confirms today that he will run, and we'll talk to him about that in just a few minutes. In what might well go down as a master stroke in Idaho politics, George Hansen assembled several hundred of the party faithful last night in Pocatello, presented a spirited defense, had a poll, and seemingly sent many of them and himself away convinced that he can win re-election. Although it was billed as a news conference, it turned out to be more of a campaign kickoff rally. With Hansen repeating a charge he's made this week that the U.S. Justice Department has practiced selective prosecution in his case while ignoring alleged financial irregularities by Attorney General William French Smith.
I think it's very interesting that the Attorney General of the United States was reported to have not completed his Ethics in Government Act forms properly just a few months ago. He's the boss of the prosecutors that took me to the courtroom. Do you think they dared touch him? He was called in for a little counseling. I asked if he wanted to alter his form. He turned in a new form. Everything went on hunky-dory. There's 2 standards of justice at justice. One for some types of people, and other for the people they don't like. Long time ago,
even his greatest opponents acknowledge that George Hansen can be a powerful speaker on the stump, and he was last night.
And we will win this one. The attorneys have told you that that is such a stinking case that we will win it. But there will be bumps. There will be things that will shock you in the paper. Possibly every time somebody makes some kind of a crazy decision like's been done. Now, I guess the choice, as far as I'm concerned, compared to anybody else, the future of the country, the future of the party, and all of those things you have to take in consideration, the choice is just one thing. If you want us to continue on, and it's entirely legally possible, if you want us to continue on, I guess you'll just have to decide one thing. You want someone who's been there, who's very senior in the Republican ranks, who's just about the top of the committee on important finance, agriculture committees, important for this state. Somebody who knows how to get things done, and I think somebody who's demonstrated that we'll go to the wall with you to help you. Or do you want to have to break in somebody new and wait for 10 or 15 years for them to get the same kind of ability to act for you? Now, it may cost you.
But some Republicans, particularly from Ada County, aren't convinced. County Chairman Lorna Auld said she wouldn't have gone to Pocatello had she known it was going to be a Hansen rally. And she says a Hansen campaign will be painful for the party.
It's painful for the party in Ada County. Okay, it may not be so much so here on this side of the state, but in Ada County it is very painful because you get a lot of people who are not as conservative and they find this kind of thing offensive and they back away and don't want to participate with the party structure, saying this is an embarrassment. I don't want to be involved if that's the man who's going to represent me. And I think that's unfair to the other people in our county who run on the Republican ticket.
But the Bannock County Republican chairman had different advice, even though he says he's been hearing from a lot of people who have serious concerns about a Hansen candidacy.
My recommendation is that he should run in the primary. If it is true that he has lost a great deal of support among Republicans, the only Democratic way to point that out is in a primary. You shouldn't really expect him not to run or to declare that he won't run because there is no support with the primary here just 6 weeks away.
National Committee woman Janet Miller thinks a Hansen campaign will hurt the party, but she says that's a decision only he can make.
At this point, I can see a lot of the strong support that has been there in the past that has eroded. He and his family and his supporters have put on very hard races in the past. I would be the last to say that he couldn't be elected, but I think, it would be very difficult this time.
Hansen conducted something of a media blitz through Boise today, granting several interviews and having a news conference this afternoon. I talked with him earlier this afternoon.
Well, we've been conducting a bit of a survey. The folks and I here in Idaho have had a contract for years. I go back to Washington and fight for them, and they've been good enough to fight for me. And in my surveys, we've found that there's a very strong sentiment that we still have some work to do together, and so I will be making my announcement, formal announcement next week to run for re-election.
The big rally meeting in Pocatello last night must have been encouraging for you.
Very encouraging. It was an open meeting, as you know. It was sponsored by the State Central Committee for the Republican Party, and everyone was invited, friend and foe and curiosity seeker or whatever, and it was a pretty large meeting and a lot of spirited participation, but they did conduct a survey at the end, and it was very, very favorable.
Can you give me some idea of how it broke down?
Yes, in fact, I think you're one of the first to find out, but on the public segment, we had about 88%, a little over 88%, that felt that we should stay in there and go on. And among the Republican office holders, we had, this is precinct committeemen, this type of thing, we had over 71%. And among the elected Republican officials, we had some 70%. It averaged out 85%.
Certainly, I don't think there's any question about it. In the last few days, there's been a great many Republicans say, Congressman, you ought to go for it. But there are, I think it's safe to say, a good many Republicans who are concerned about your candidacy.
Certainly.
What do you say to those folks?
Well, I respect their concern. You can't take a bump like we did and not have someone wonder, well, is this one that you can't get over or whatever. But every election, it seems like we're having some kind of a fight with some kind of a federal agency. And as you know, I'm always taking citizens' fights on, whether it's the Labor Department with OSHA or the Immigration Service, Department of Justice, the Internal Revenue Service. And we've had those fights every election. A lot of folks every time think, oh boy, this one's going to get him, you know. But we're firmly convinced that we're right, that this thing will be turned around in proper course, and there's no reason to stop now.
We have the Ada County Republican chairman on videotape today saying that it's her advice to you not to run because you'll hurt the party here in this part of the state particularly. Concerned about that?
Well, I respect that, but I think sometimes maybe some of these folks haven't heard the other side of it. First is you have to think through, do you want to take maybe a bit of a bump while we get through this and perhaps receive the kind of immunizing that an activist like myself needs to protect the interests of Idaho against the encroaching bureaucracy? Somebody who has 7 terms of seniority, one of the senior members of Congress, high up on the committees of Concerned Idaho. Do you want to forfeit all that to put somebody new on the track who you don't even know what he's going to give you when he gets there, or whether he can stay there after you do elect him?
Do you have any concern, Congressman, that maybe even if you do fight this fight and win it, that you have been so badly hurt both here and in Washington that it'd be just very difficult for you to be a good congressman?
Well, if you'd have been at the meeting last night, I think what you find is that people are so incensed at the government running roughshod over the people here, and it isn't just George Hansen, it's the farmers who have the Immigration Service breaking the law to file phony charges against them, Internal Revenue Service making a lot of improper actions as far as people are concerned. People are tired of this excessive amount of bureaucracy. In fact, I had one person today tell me that the real fight right now is, will the people be able to overpower the bureaucrats?
Even if it takes a year or two to sort all of this out, you can be an effective congressman in that
Sure,
time?
I don't have to spend the time. You hire attorneys for that, and they take care of the legal problems. I take care of my job.
You said last night in Pocatello that the Justice Department, you've said it before last night, but that the Justice Department has displayed a double standard in their prosecution of you. In essence, saying that the Attorney General of the United States might have something that is worthy of prosecution. Are you charging him with something?
No, I think someone maybe misinterpreted that. What I said is a few months ago, and it was widespread in the news, that the Attorney General had apparently made some errors on his filing reports, and of course he's the boss of these guys who were prosecuting me. What they do with him, offered him some counseling services, the opportunity to amend, so forth. I'm not saying he did anything wrong. I'm just saying that there's two standards at the Justice Department. They brought it to his attention, he amended it. In my case, I had relied on legal counsel, not just one lawyer, but two. Did we file our reports right? Absolutely. We went to the committee. I didn't just wait for the committee to call me. I went to the committee and said, this is what we're doing. You advise me if it's wrong, and I have the right to rely on their advice. And they didn't do it. I can tell you there are 40 or 50 members of Congress that probably are very vulnerable because of this. The U.S. News and World Report, shortly after the indictment of me, came out and said there were 146 congressmen scrambled in to amend their reports. Well, I don't think those congressmen necessarily did anything wrong on the reports. But up till that time, the Congress was content in the idea they would police their own situation, and if there was any problem, it would be a civil penalty, just a $5,000 penalty of some fine of this sort. But the Justice Department came in and criminalized the thing, scared everybody to death. I'll tell you, there's 535 fish in a rain barrel, 535 congressmen and senators, if this Justice Department employee works against me, that are vulnerable to the Justice Department shooting those fish in the rain barrel. They can get anyone anytime they want, and I'm sure a lot of fellows weren't as careful with their reports as I was. I had attorneys advising me. I think a lot of people in Idaho and other places think old George Hansen's a hip shooter. He just files those reports, you know, recklessly, whatever. Believe me, after my first fight with Wayne Hayes years ago, I found out you hire lawyers, you hire accountants, and you do things carefully, and we have done things carefully.
But again, back to the comments you made about the Attorney General. You're saying, in essence, that he got away with what you've been convicted of.
I'm saying that he had problems with his reports, even conflict of interest problems, something even more severe than anything that they're looking at me for, and they did nothing but allow him to amend the reports. And they came over and they did not give me the opportunity to amend, even though I probably would not, because I think we did it right. But I never had any of the same opportunities that he had.
I've asked you this question before and you answer it always well, but let me try it one more time. Why would a Republican Justice Department run by a Republican Attorney General, directed by a Republican President, want to get one of the most Republican congressmen, one of the most conservative Republican congressmen who right down the line has supported the President?
Well, I think the question is a good question, but it doesn't really reach the issue. The point is that it isn't a Republican President and a Republican Attorney General that are doing it. It's a bunch of bureaucrats that are doing it. Washington and government is run by bureaucrats. The politicians come and go. One president's in for 4 years or 8 years. His people are there for a short time, and they go. It's the bureaucrats make these decisions, and the bureaucrats, when they get these things on track, especially something legal, a lot of these folks are very afraid to get in with any kind of conflicting operation. For instance, I went to Bill Simon, the Secretary of the Treasury, once, and I said, Mr. Simon, why don't you please call the head of the Internal Revenue Service and help this constituent of mine who had a problem? I said, it's grossly unfair. He said, gee, George, don't ask me to call the head of the IRS about this. He said, Jack Anderson or somebody will get the idea I'm trying to exert political influence. That's the kind of climate you run into. It's not Mr. Reagan or Mr. Smith or anybody else that's my problem. It's a fight against bureaucrats. It always has been on any of these fights of mine.
You know, to some folks, it might sound like you have lost respect for the justice system.
No, I have great respect for the justice system, but I find that it breaks down in a lot of places. I think about 10, 15 years ago, this government turned a corner from being a government of service to a government somewhat geared to oppression, heavy-handedness. And I think that all of us as citizens need to get this thing back on track. I had an IRS guy who retired some time ago tell me that about up till 1967 or 68, that the Internal Revenue Service had been geared toward trying to help people to stay in business and pay their taxes and do those sorts of things, helpful things. The word service meant something in Internal Revenue Service. And then all at once they shifted gears, and they said they wanted seizures, and pretty soon, you know, and assessments. And pretty soon agents, just like a traffic policeman or someone, is gauged on how many seizures, how many bank accounts he can seize, how many pieces of property you can seize. And when you're judged on that, pretty soon it gets to be pretty heavy-handed. And that's the problem, I think, is government has turned a corner from being a government of service to a government, in some respects, of oppression.
But again, you were charged by a grand jury. You had the opportunity to be defended by obviously eminently qualified counsel. You were judged guilty by a jury of your peers. That's the way the system works.
Now, most people know anything about a grand jury know there's an extension of the power of the prosecutors. So you can say grand jury if you want, but they usually do what the prosecutors ask them to do. So I was charged basically by the Justice Department when you get right down to it. And who in the Justice Department? Well, I think it was brought out in the trial that there's some question about political ambition. But even more than that, when you get into a trial where the issues are very...
Excuse me, let me just interrupt there. Political ambition in what way? Make an example out of this congressman, succeed in prosecuting him, and you advance, or what?
Well, if you can bag a prominent public official or a prominent person in public, it goes a long way in Washington toward helping you to become another step up the ladder, a federal judge, or any number of things. And so a little notoriety, I guess, never hurts anyone, some people feel. But more than that, these people were so concerned about sensationalizing, politicizing the case in court. They were holding up the fact that commodity transactions could be in the millions of dollars. They were trying to make it look like we were some kind of a swashbuckling pair, my wife and I dealing in high finances or something else. The issue was not that. The issue was whether we had filed our reports properly. We did file our reports properly. What they were doing is clouding the issue, and my counsel feels we have an airtight case of getting this thing reserved when we get it out of the political atmosphere of the Washington courts into an area where they're deciding on law.
Is that jury political too?
Sure, you have a jury in Washington, D.C. talk about being judged by a jury of your peers. Well, Washington, D.C. is hardly Idaho in terms, and I think anybody who goes there knows that. You have an area where politically they're just the reverse of Idaho, heavy liberal Democrat. They've never voted Republican. I mean, it's just different. Culturally, it's the inner city versus a rural area. Very different, and most of the jurors, of course, are public workers or federal workers. So you have the federal government bringing charges with federal workers and so forth. No, I don't think it was by any means the kind of court you'd want to find yourself in.
You mentioned the swashbuckling finances. I would assume that there are people who, deep down in their heart of hearts, think George Hansen is the best congressman they could have, but wonder why you seem to have so much trouble with your finances.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Do you know how much this case has cost me? Around $250,000, a fortune. And I've had that kind of thing thrust at me by people who have been putting accusing fingers on for years. I've went through the Wayne Hayes thing, we went through the Federal Election Commission stuff, all by usually political detractors saying, George is doing something wrong, go sick him, go look at him. And this adds up over the years, and pretty soon there's no normal person, you or me or anyone else, can withstand that kind of an assault and stay out of debt. And so it's that debt we were trying to service. Now Hubert Humphrey, when he got into a political debt, settled out for 2 cents on the dollar. Well, that was his way of doing it. My way of doing it is paying my bills honorably. We've hung on to that debt. We didn't take out bankruptcy. We didn't go into default. We've hung on and tried to do the best we can to pay it, and we're basically pretty well ahead of it. But it took a lot of time and a lot of effort. And who were we owing? Mostly, except for a sensational piece or two like the bunker hunt, the people of Idaho, our friends who were helping us, and I sure didn't want to hurt them. That's what it was all about.
Why not other maverick congressmen? Why George Hansen? Why not Jack Kemp? Or why not Congressman Weaver, who's a maverick in Oregon, or Denny Smith in Oregon?
Well, I guess it depends on whose boat you're rocking and how far. Most of those people you named weren't the ones that showed up in Nebraska to help get the ministers out of jail when the Justice Department wouldn't do anything and put the pressure on the Justice Department, help those people against that oppression. It's the same thing when I went to Bolivia to get the boy from Idaho out of a Bolivian prison. I walked on the toes of the State Department and the Justice Department in some ways. Iran was the same way. OSHA was the same way. The Internal Revenue Service in Rexburg when they were trying to take capital gains taxes from flood victims and things like this. Believe me, when you walk on enough toes, you make a lot of enemies. But I think the people of Idaho know that the toes I've walked on basically have been for the people's interests here, and I've assumed their enemies as well as you know, you get a lot of benefits from being there, but you get a lot of enemies.
We now turn to three reporters for some analysis, reporters who have covered George Hansen. Rod Grammer is the political editor of the Idaho Statesman newspaper in Boise. John Dillon covers politics for the Idaho State Journal newspaper in Pocatello. And Paula Whistle, a producer of this broadcast, works for public station KISU in Pocatello. Rod Grammer, let me start with you. How do you gauge George Hansen's political situation tonight?
Well, Mark, I think that it looks pretty good for the primary. I think that odds are George will win the primary because he's got a solid base of support in the Republican Party yet, even despite the convictions, and perhaps even stronger among his most rabid supporters. I'd say for the general election, it's more difficult, though. Many Republicans I talked to today said flatly that he will lose the general election, and they're very concerned about that. But and even his strong supporters think it's going to be an uphill fight.
John Dillon, you were at the, both of you were, you and Paula both were at that meeting in Pocatello last night. It strikes me as though that was a brilliant bit of political theater, if you will, to assemble all of those Republican Party faithful, take a poll of them, and then come away being able to say, gee, they all support me.
Political theater is correct. It was a well-orchestrated evening. They put on a mini version of their defense case, which most Idahoans did not get to see, and the intent was just to show George Hansen as a winner. George Hansen has not been defeated, and if they let out that George Hansen could lose, it would be the end of his political career, perhaps.
Paula, you agree with that?
Well, it was very well orchestrated, and obviously orchestrated to show the positive side of George Hansen and his case, and it did seem that anything negative that came out of it, any negative questions, and there were several presented not only by reporters but also by some Republicans from Twin Falls, that the questions weren't answered, and they in fact were booed by the crowd, and so it was definitely George Hansen's evening.
Do you both agree with Rod's assessment that maybe the congressman is in fairly good shape as the primary approaches only 6 weeks away, but that the general election might be another story? John?
Well, gauging from what Republican leaders in this area say, I think George will be victorious in the primary, and gauging also from those same people, George is going to have trouble winning in November. There's a lot of time between the May 22nd primary and November. I'm sure George will do his best to create a few bumps, as he puts it, for his opposition, but it doesn't look good right now.
Will we see any, do you think, any of these Republicans who talked this week about getting in this race, will we see any of them get in the race now?
It's my feeling that it's amazing. One day we have people saying that George will not win, and he should not run, and then the next day we get a feeling that these people are reversing their stands, and suddenly they're throwing themselves behind George again and trying not to let out an air of dissension within the party.
Yeah. Rod, do you think any of those folks, Dane Watkins, Bob Geddes, some of those folks that we're talking about possibly getting in the race will? No?
No, Mark, all those people you mentioned I talked to earlier this week, and they all said that if George runs, they will not run, and they will all support him vigorously. And I think that's the way it is down the line. George's supporters will not run against him, and if he decides to do this, they're going to support him all the way.
Rod, do you think he can make, Congressman Hansen can make these arguments that he's the big government fighter, the bureaucratic fighter? Can he make that stick? I mean, he's used those arguments successfully before.
Well, Mark, you got to look at the district we're talking about. It's the 2nd District of Idaho. It's very conservative, perhaps one of the most conservative districts in the state, in the country. And he is a populist figure, a conservative populist figure. And the things he was saying on your show tonight, things he told us today in Boise at the press conferences and such, really sell well in that part of the state. They believe him. They have for a decade now, and I think that that the people who believe these things all along will continue to believe them, and perhaps will even get out and work harder for him to protect his seat. The question is, how many of those people in the middle who have always voted for George will finally throw up their arms and say, I've had enough, I'm going to vote for a Democrat, even if he's a Democrat, I'm going to vote for the Democrat.
I thought it was interesting that the congressman seemed to be making some of the same arguments about his seniority and his position on committees and his ability, because of his length of his service, his ability to get things done in the Congress, the same sorts of arguments that you heard Frank Church make, for example, in 1980.
Well, it's interesting how things kind of turn around. For example, George is making the arguments that his seniority, his position in Washington is a help to the people of Idaho. That didn't work for Frank Church. Seems to be catching on for George Hansen. The other thing is that the people who are supporting George are the same people who believe in the justice system. They believe when a person's found guilty, he's guilty. These are the same people, conservatives, who support the death penalty when someone's convicted of murder or something else, and think these people should go to jail. So it's interesting how people can kind of turn issues, and both liberals and conservatives do this, and I think we're seeing it now on this issue.
Let's talk about the Democrats here for just a second. Paula, I know you talked to Mel Morgan, the Democratic Party chairman from Pocatello today. What is he saying about this situation?
Well, the first thing he said, of course, is that it was no surprise to him, and in fact, he felt it had been orchestrated from the word go before George Hansen even arrived in Idaho from Washington, that he had it all orchestrated and was planning to run all along. He also said he thinks it's the best thing that could happen to the Democratic Party is for George to be elected in the primary, because he feels that Stallings, who he says didn't lose by that many votes last time, I think only 7,000 according to him, that Stallings can beat him this time.
John, Richard Stallings filed his nominating petitions and is officially in the race as of today. Do you think he's getting his campaign act together?
Richard is doing 100% better as far as early organization in this area. He's already has an office open here in Pocatello. He has two full-time people working for him, planning strategy. It seems to me that Richard is ready to go, and he's willing to fight this time and win.
Rod, do you agree? Richard Stallings got rapped a lot 2 years ago for running a bad campaign in terms of organization and money and all those things.
He seems more self-assured this year than he did 2 years ago, and more polished on the stump at press conferences and giving speeches. The other factor, I think, is that he's going to have a lot more money than he did 2 years ago. 2 years ago, he was an unknown. People were reluctant to give him money. There was a popular race in the 1st District where the Democrats put a lot of their money. And I think this time he's going to have a lot of money to run against Hansen, and should do better than he did last time.
Well, I guess the bottom line is that Idaho politics are never dull.
No, it's been a great couple days.
Rod Grammer, thanks for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. And John Dillon, thank you. And Paula, thank you very much. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back on Monday. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.